Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Robert from El Magnifico Games, and today we are going to continue our normal Wednesday poetry, prose, and riddles stream series. So, starting with the poetry, as we normally do. Last week we finished by looking at a poem by George Herbert called Virtue, and as always we will begin by rereading this poem. That is the last poem we looked at, and then we will move on to some poems we haven't looked at before. Now, George Herbert was this individual. He was a Welsh poet, orator and priest of the Church of England. We would have looked in more detail about who he was last week, so I won't repeat that. Just quickly checking if there's anything really important to mention or re-mention. I suppose just so that other than rising quite high in people's regards as a poet, being quite successful after the death of King James, he renewed his interest in ordination and became a priest. So, this poem, entitled Virtue. Sweet day, so cool, so calm, so bright, the bridal of the earth and sky, the dew shall weep thy fall tonight, for thou must die. Sweet rose, whose hue, angry and brave, bids the rash gazer wipe his eye, thy root is ever in its grave, and thou must die. Sweet spring, full of sweet days and roses, a box where sweets compacted lie, my music shows ye have your closes, and all must die. Only a sweet and virtuous soul, like seasoned timber, never gives, but though the whole world turn to coal, then chiefly lives. So yes, quite a lot to unpack there, but again, this is the poem that we finished off on last week, so rather than look through it again, we will move on. Unless there's anything anyone would really like to discuss. If so, then by all means leave it in chat. So, the next poem is entitled The Virgins to Make Much of Time by Robert Henrick. He was a 17th century lyric poet and an Anglican cleric. So again we see the meeting of faith and poetry. He is best known for Hesperides, a book of poems. This includes the Carpe Diem poem To the Virgins to Make Much of Time, and with the first line, gather your rosebuds while ye may. Born in Cheapside, London, Robert Herrick was the seventh child and fourth son of Julia Stone and Nicholas Herrick, a prosperous goldsmith. He was named after an uncle, Robert Herrick, or Hayrick, a prosperous member of Parliament for Leicestershire. Okay, so apart from the fact that obviously he went on to be a priest, we have further confirmation that he was from a middle-class background, who would bought the land, Greyfriars Abbey, stood on after Henry VIII's dissolution in the mid-18th century. Yeah, that makes sense, that would have been only shortly afterwards. Nicholas Herrick died in a fall from a fourth-floor window in November 1592, when Robert was a year old. Whether this was suicide remains unclear. The tradition that Herrick received his education at Westminster is based on the words "beloved Westminster" in his poem Tears to Tamasis. But the allusion is to the city, not the school. It is more likely that he, like his uncle's children, attended the Merchant Taylors' School. In 1607, he became apprenticed to his other uncle, Sir William Herrick, a goldsmith and jeweller to the king. The apprenticeship ended after 6 years when Herrick, aged 22, gained admission at St John's College, Cambridge. He later migrated to Trinity Hall, graduating in 1617. Herrick became a member of the Sons of Ben, a group centred on an admiration for the work of Ben Jonson, to whom he wrote at least 5 poems. Herrick was ordained into the Church of England in 1623 and in 1629 became the vicar of Dean Prior in Devonshire. Civil War. In 1647, in the wake of the English Civil War, Herrick was ejected from his vicarage for refusing the Solemn League and Covenant, which was an agreement between the Scottish Covenanters and the leaders of the English parliamentarians in 1643 during the First English Civil War, a theatre of conflict. Okay. He returned to London to live in Westminster and depend on the charity of his friends and family. He spent some time preparing his lyric poems for publication and had them printed in 1648 under the title Hesperides, or The Works Both Human and Divine of Robert Herrick, with a dedication to the Prince of Wales. Interesting. So I wonder if that makes him broadly royalist. Restoration and later life. When King Charles II was restored to the throne in 1660, Herrick petitioned for his own restoration to his living. He had obtained favour by writing verses celebrating the births of both Charles II and his brother James before the Civil War. Herrick became the vicar of Dean Prior again in the summer of 1662 and lived there until his death in October 1674 at the age of 83. His date of death is unknown, but he was buried on the 15th of October. Herrick was a bachelor all his life. Many of the women he names in his poems are thought to be fictional. He is buried in the churchyard of St George the Martyr, Parish Church, Dean Prior. Okay. As normal, I'm not going to read the whole Wikipedia page, but that should give us some context for who he was, which may be useful in interpreting his poetry. Or it may not. We shall see. So, I will proceed with the first reading of To the Virgins to make much of time. And I notice that the first line of each stanza is preceded with a number. I'm going to assume that I'm not supposed to read that number out, and that is just numbering the stanzas. But if upon reading it becomes apparent that I am, then I'll go back and read it again. Gather ye rosebuds while ye may, old time is still a-flying, and this same flower that smiles today, tomorrow will be dying. The glorious lamp of heaven, the sun, the higher he's a-getting, the sooner will his race be run, and nearer he's to setting. The age is best which is the first, when youth and blood are warmer, but being spent the worse and worst, times still succeed the former. Then be not coy, but use your time, and while ye may go marry, for having lost but once your prime, you may forever tarry. Seems like quite a powerful poem to me. As Wikipedia pointed out, it's very much a carpe diem poem, to seize the day, while you still can. It appears to have a AB rhyming scheme. I will now try to determine whether there is any meter. Okay, so there doesn't seem to be a consistent number of syllables in each verse, so I'm therefore concluding that there probably isn't a meter. There's a tendency for it to be around 8 syllables, though. Some verses seem to have 9 or 10 syllables, some 7, but it's a tendency towards 8, so it is going to have a certain rhythm to it, as it were, since each verse is going to be approximately the same amount of time to say, but not a full meter. So I will proceed to read the poem again. If there is anything that anyone in chat would like to discuss, please write it in chat, and I will address that after I have finished rereading this. Otherwise, we shall move on. So once again, to the virgins to make much of time. Gather ye rosebuds. Sorry. Gather ye rosebuds while ye may. Old time is still a flying, and this same flower that smiles today, tomorrow will be dying. The glorious lamp of heaven, the sun, the higher he's a getting, the sooner will his race be run, and nearer he's to setting. That age is best, which is the first, when youth and blood are warmer, but being spent the worse and worst, times still succeed the former. Then be not coy, but use your time, and while ye may, go marry, for having lost but once your prime, ye may forever tarry. I do find the title of the poem interesting, To the Virgins to Make Much of Time. I'm sure that must be a reference to something that I'm not getting. Still, assuming there's nothing that we'd like to discuss, I will move on to the next poem, which is To Anthea, who may command him anything. This is also by Robert Herrick. Bid me to Bid me to live, and I will live, thy Protestant to be, or bid me love, and I will give a loving heart to thee, a heart as soft, a heart as kind, a heart as sound and free, as in the whole world thou canst find, that heart I'll give to thee. Bid that heart stay, and it will stay, to honour thy decree, or bid it languish quite away, and shall do so for thee. Bid me to weep, and I will weep, while I have eyes to see, and having none, yet I will keep a heart to weep for thee. Bid me despair, and I'll despair, under that cypress tree, or bid me die, and I will dare, even death to die for thee. Thou art my life, my love, my heart, the very eyes of me, and hast command of every part, to live and die for thee. So again, quite a powerful poem, in my opinion. This poem returns to one of the main themes of poetry that we've seen in this anthology, which is romance. This time speaking of an undying love. It is notable, both in the title and the content of the poem, that this one has themes of command. That the one who is loved may control the one that loves them. Which I don't think we've seen before. I may be mistaken, but I don't think we've seen it before. We also seem to have an AB rhyming scheme. I was wondering what the ant was doing, or is, because obviously it's an abbreviation, but it's not one that I recognise. I think it must be "and it shall do so" for the... Okay, so let's look for some sort of meter. Looks like every odd numbered verse has 8 syllables and every even one has 6 syllables. So that regularity does raise the possibility that there might be some sort of meter here, which I will continue looking for. I don't think there's a consistent meter here. There is certainly a tendency towards it being iambic. Consider the verses: a heart as soft, a heart as kind, a heart as sound and free. That clearly is an iambic meter, and it's I mean, you can hear the rhythm. I know I exaggerated a bit there, but you know, it really has a strong rhythm to it. But then, as a counterexample, bid that heart stay and it will stay to honour thy decree. That's not iambic, clearly. So, as we have seen in quite a few poems so far, it seems like there is an effort made to create a particular effect, but that the author isn't too concerned if they can't make it perfect. So you end up with these poems which are partially iambic or partially or become very close to having a fixed number of syllables in each verse, but don't quite manage it, which is fine. I think it's a very good compromise between being... I think it's a very good compromise between trying to create a particular... what's the word? To create a particular sound, and between freedom of writing, because of course the more you try and stick to a particular meter, the harder it can be to express your sentiments. Because you're quite directly limited in what you can write. Anyway, I think that's all I really have to say on the subject. I will proceed to the final reading of this poem. Again, if anyone has any questions, please pop them into chat. These could be questions to me. These could be things that you'd like me to look up. These could be things you'd like discussed, more open questions, anything like that. Pop it in chat and I will have a look once I have finished the final reading of this poem. So once again, this is to Anthea, who may command him anything. Bid me to live and I will live, thy Protestant to be, or bid me love and I will give a loving heart to thee. A heart as soft, a heart as kind, a heart as sound and free, as in the whole world thou canst find, that heart I'll give to thee. Bid that heart stay and it will stay, to honour thy decree, or bid it languish quite away, and shan't do so for thee. Bid me to weep and I will weep, while I have eyes to see, and having none, yet I will keep a heart to weep for thee. Bid me despair and I'll despair under that cypress tree, or bid me die and I will dare, even death to die for thee. Thou art my love, my sorry. Thou art my life, my love, my heart, the very eyes of me, and hast command of every part to live and die for thee. So things that particularly stick out to me, even now, are verses such as thy Protestant to be. I'm not entirely certain what he's getting at there. Obviously, we all know what a Protestant is, but I feel like there's a significance to that I'm not getting. The only thing that I can think is that, of course, this poem would have been written within living memory of the Reformation, when Henry VIII no, actually, I don't know when this was written. I was going to say when Henry VIII reformed the church, changing England from being Catholic to Protestant. But actually, if this was written later in life, later in Robert Herrick's life, then it wouldn't have been within living memory of the Reformation. If it was written earlier in his life, then it would. But the point I'm making is it wasn't that long ago, and notably in the Catholic Church, priests cannot marry. They are supposed to be celibate their entire life. Protestant priests can. The author was a priest, so the only thing I can think of is maybe the lines, bid me to live and I will live, thy Protestant to be, maybe could be making a direct reference to the fact that he's eligible for marriage, whereas his predecessors wouldn't have always. Best I can think of. Could be very, very wrong. In fact, probably am very, very wrong, but that's the only thing I can think of. So that stood out to me. And the other thing that really stood out to me was, bid me despair and I'll despair under that cypress tree. I'm not sure what the reference to a cypress tree is doing there. Obviously, cypress trees would have been associated with Greece. At least I think they would have. I don't know, maybe it's a reference to Greek tragic tragedies. Of course, a very famous genre within ancient Greek literature and indeed performances. That's my best guess, but I may be very wrong. That may be a specific reference to, say, some moment in Greek mythology or something like that I'm just not getting. I don't know. Still, I think that's about all I can say about this poem. So, unless there's anything people would like to discuss, we'll move on. So, next we are looking at some poems by Thomas Hood. He appears to have been much more recent. He would have been Georgian, and Victoria would have been on the throne when he died. Thomas Hood was an English poet, author and humorist, best known for his poems such as The Bridge of Sighs and The Song of the Shirt, at least one of which we'll be looking at. Hood wrote regularly for the London magazine, Athenaeum, and Punch. He later published a magazine largely consisting of his own works. Hood, never robust, had lapsed into invalidism by the age of 41 and died at the age of 45. William Michael Rossetti in 1903 called him the finest English poet between the generations of Shelley and Tennyson. Hood was the father of the playwright and humorist Tom Hood and the children's writer Francis Freeling Broderick, whose name I'm probably butchering. Thomas Hood was born to Thomas Hood and Elizabeth Sands in the Poultry, Cheapside, London, above his father's workshop. His father's family had been Scottish farmers from the village of Errol, near Dundee. The elder Hood was a partner in the business of Werner Hood and Sharp, a member of the Associated Booksellers. Hood's son, Tom Hood, claimed that his grandfather had been the first to open up the book trade with America and had had great success with new editions of old books. Next to being a citizen of the world, writes Thomas Hood in his literary reminiscences, it must be the best thing to be born a citizen of the world's greatest city. On the death of her husband in 1811, Hood's mother moved to Islington, where he had a schoolmaster who, in appreciating his talents, made him feel it impossible not to take an interest in learning while he seemed so interested in teaching. Under the care of this decayed dominie, he earned a few guineas, his first literary fee, by revising for the press a new edition of the 1788 novel Paul and Virginia. Hood left his private schoolmaster at 14 years of age and was admitted soon after into the counting house of a friend of his family, where he turned his stool into a Pegasus on 3 legs, every foot of course being a dactyl or a spondee. A spondee I know to be... Yeah, dactyl and spondee are both types of... what's the word? Metrical feet, which would make up a meter. So I'm not sure what they mean there. However, the uncongenial profession affected his health, which was never strong, and he began to study engraving. The exact nature and course of his study is unclear. Various sources tell different stories. Reed emphasises his work under his maternal uncle Robert Sands, but no deeds of apprenticeship exist, and his letters show he studied with a Mr. Harris, Hood's daughter. Studied with a Mr. Harris, Hood's daughter, in her memorials. Hood's daughter, in her memorials, mentions her father's association with Lee Koo brothers, who were successful engravers in the city. The labour of engraving was better for his health than the counting house had been, and Hood was sent to his father's relations at Dundee, Scotland. There he stayed in the house of his maternal aunt, Jean Kay, for some months. Then, on falling out with her, he moved on to the boarding house of one of her friends, Mrs. Butterworth, where he lived for the rest of his time in Scotland. In Dundee, Hood made a number of close friends with whom he continued to correspond for many years. He led a healthy outdoor life. He also became a wide and indiscriminate reader. At the same time, he began seriously to write poetry, and he appeared in print for the first time with a letter to the editor of the Dundee Advertiser. Before long, Hood was contributing humorous and poetical pieces to provincial newspapers and magazines. As a proof of his literary vocation, he would write out his poems in printed characters, believing that this process best enabled him to understand his own peculiarities and faults, and probably unaware that Samuel Taylor Coleridge had recommended some such method of criticism when he said he thought print settles it. On his return to London in 1818, he applied himself to engraving, which enabled him later to illustrate his various humours and fancies. In 1821, John Scott, editor of the London magazine, was killed in a duel, and the periodical passed into the hands of some friends of Hood, who proposed to make him sub-editor. This post at once introduced him to the literary society of the time. He gradually developed his powers, becoming an associate of John Hamilton Reynolds, Charles Lamb, Henry Carey, Thomas de Quincey, Alan Cunningham, Brian Proctor, Sergeant Talford, Hartley Coleridge, and the peasant poet John Clare, and other contributors. Again, I won't read the entirety of this Wikipedia page, but hopefully that gives us some sense of who Thomas Hood was. And hopefully that may contribute to our understanding of his poetry. So the first poem we have from Thomas Hood is entitled The Deathbed. I shall begin. We watched her breathing through the night, her breathing soft and low, as in her breast the wave of life kept heaving to and fro. So silently we seemed to speak, so slowly moved about, as we had lent her half our powers to eke her living out. Our very hopes belied our fears our hopes belied. We thought her dying when she slept, and sleeping when she died. For when the morn came dim and sad, and chill with early showers, her quiet eyelids closed, she had another morn than ours. Quite sorrowful. So that's touching on another major theme of poetry, or at least the poetry in this anthology, at a minimum, and that's death. We have seen quite a few poems which seem to combine romance and death, but this one, at least at first sight, appears to only be a meditation on death itself. This is actually a very good example of what I was talking about before, how sometimes poems seem to have broken forms, where it seems like the author was trying to write according to a particular structure, but then for whatever reason decided to make exceptions. So this poem seems to be tending towards an AB rhyming structure, but it is quite inconsistent in its in actually enforcing that structure. So perhaps the last stanza is the best example, where we have sad and had, and showers and hours. But in the first stanza, we have low and fro, but night and life clearly don't rhyme. And we have, in the next stanza, about and out, but speak and powers clearly don't rhyme. And so forth. So, actually quite a lot of the poem seems to have a sort of ABCB rhyming scheme. Anyway, meter. Does this poem have a meter? Let's see. So it certainly seems to want to have 8 syllables on odd lines, on odd verses, and 6 on even. But it doesn't always achieve that. So again, a sort of broken structure. I think it's also, I could be wrong, I think it is also trying to be iambic in places, but again, it's inconsistent. So a good example would be her breathing soft and low. That seems iambic to me. Or kept heaving to and fro. Though arguably the kept should also be stressed. But then an example which doesn't seem iambic would be another morn than ours. Because you wouldn't say another. So yes, I'd say overall, this poem, it clearly is a poem in every sense. There clearly has been attention paid to the sound of it, as well as the content. But it is one of the looser ones, I think. But probably no less powerful for it. Or at the very least, it's notable how emotive it seems to be. Perhaps it would have been more emotive had it kept more stringently to a structure. One couldn't possibly say. But it certainly doesn't seem to lack in emotive power. So I will move on to the final reading. Again, if anyone has anything they'd like to ask about it or just discuss, please put it in chat. And I'll look at that after I have finished reading this again. So, the deathbed. We watched her breathing through the night, her breathing soft and low, as in her breast the wave of life kept heaving to and fro. So silently we seemed to speak, so slowly moved about, as we had lent her half our powers to eke her living out. Our very hopes belied our fears our hopes belied. We thought her dying when she slept, and sleeping when she died. For when the morn came dim and sad, and chill with early showers, her quiet eyelids closed, she had another morn than ours. Okay, so the next poem, also by Robert Hood, appears to be a significantly longer one, called The Bridge of Sighs. So, I will begin. The very first line seems to be drowned from Hamlet. I'm not entirely sure the function of that quote, but we shall see. So, the Bridge of Sighs. One more unfortunate, weary of breath, rashly important, gone to her death. Take her up tenderly, lift her with care, fashioned so slenderly, young and so fair. Look at her garments, clinging like cerements, whilst the wave constantly drips from her clothing. Take her up instantly, loving not loathing, touch her not scornfully, think of her mournfully, gently and humanly, not of the stains of her. All that remains of her now is pure womanly. Make no deep scrutiny into her mutiny, rash and undutiful, past all dishonour, death has left on her only the beautiful. Still for all slips of her, one of Eve's family, wipe this poor lips of her, oozing so clammily. Loop up her tresses, escaped from the comb, her fair auburn tresses, whilst wonderment guesses, where was her home? Who was her father? Who was her mother? Had she a sister? Had she a brother? Or was there a dearer one, still, and a nearer one, yet than all other? Alas for the rarity of Christian charity under the sun! Oh, it was pitiful, near a whole city full. Home she had none. Sisterly, brotherly, fatherly, motherly. Feelings had changed, love by harsh evidence, thrown from its eminence, even God's providence seeming estranged. Where the lamps quiver so far in the river, with many a light, from window and casement, from garret to basement, she stood with amazement, houseless by night. The bleak wind of March made her tremble and shiver, but not the dark arch, or the black flowing river. Mad from life's history, glad to death's mystery, swift to be hurled, and where anywhere, out of the world. In she plunged boldly, no matter how coldly the rough river ran over the brink of it. Picture it, think of it, dissolute man. Lave in it, drink of it, then if you can, take her up tenderly, lift her with care, fashioned so slenderly, young and so fair. Ere her limbs frigidly, stiffened too rigidly, decently, kindly, smooth and compose them, and her eyes close them, staring so blindly, dreadfully staring, through muddy impurity, and when with the daring, last look of despairing, fixed on futurity, perishing gloomily, Spurred by contumely, cold inhumanity, burning insanity, into her rest, cross her hands humbly, as if praying dumbly, over her breast, owning her weakness, her evil behaviour, and leaving with meekness her sins to her Saviour. So another meditation on death, it would seem. This one I find interesting because I think it's also quite powerful, but I think this one really does gain a lot from its rhythm. There doesn't appear to be a consistent rhyming structure, but there is a consistent effort to rhyme. So, for example, in the first stanza we have unfortunate, impotent, breath and death. So that's just A, B, A, B. But further down we have scornfully, mournfully, humanly, her, womanly. So that's a sort of A, B, B, A structure. And as we go down further, you will see that there are all sorts of other irregular rhyming structures. So, rhythm or meter. Looks like it's aiming. Well, I've only reread the first two stanzas. They seem to follow a 6 syllables followed by 4 syllable structure. And again we see irregularities that immediately follow. So I don't think it has a consistent syllables per line. Does it even follow straightforward metrical feet? I don't think it does. Gone to her death. That would presumably be strong, weak, weak, strong. So it's fair to say that it doesn't have a consistent meter. So far as I can tell. Someone more knowledgeable may know better. But like most of the poetry we've looked at, possibly all actually, I'd have to go back and check, there's clearly been a lot of attention paid to the sound of the poem. Just because the writer didn't stick consistently to one and stringently to a particular rhyming and rhythmic structure, a meter, doesn't mean that they haven't thought about how it would sound. And this poem in particular seems to have quite the compelling sound to it. I'm going to do something we've only done once or twice before, and I'm going to look up the Wikipedia page for this particular poem, because I suspect it can probably provide us with a lot of useful context and some useful analysis as well. So, The Bridge of Sighs is a 1844 poem by Thomas Hood concerning the suicide of a homeless young woman who threw herself from the Waterloo Bridge in London. So this sounds like this is a true story then, or at least based on truth. Although Thomas Hood is usually regarded as a humorous poet, towards the end of his life, when he was on his sickbed, he wrote a number of poems commenting on contemporary poverty. These included The Song of the Shirt, The Bridge of Sighs, and The Song of the Labourer. The Bridge of Sighs is particularly well known because of its novel metre, complex three-syllable rhymes, varied rhyming scheme, and pathetic subject matter. It's my understanding that pathetic in this context would mean it's something that it is of an emotional nature. It's something that one can empathise with. It doesn't mean the more common usage of pathetic that we use pathetic for today, which would mean either contemptuous or just small and unimportant. The poem does... Oh, I was thinking, what does it mean by complex three-syllable rhymes? I wonder if that's... No, would it scornfully? Mournfully? No, those are just rhymes of three-syllable words. Those aren't three syllables that all rhyme. Oh no, it sort of does, because scorn and mourn rhyme. Humanly, womanly. Scrutiny, mutiny. Undutiful. No, undutiful isn't. So I wonder if that's what they mean by complex three-syllable rhymes. The poem describes a woman as having been immersed in the grimy water, but having been washed so that whatever sins she may have committed are obliterated by the pathos of her death. She seems to have committed suicide by jumping off a bridge after she was thrown out of her home. Make no deep scrutiny into her mutiny, rash and undutiful, past all dishonour, death has left on her only the beautiful. Several clues in the poem which harps upon beauty, sin and scorn hint that the woman was pregnant and had been thrown out of her home. I missed the pregnancy implication. I had, when it reported off as sins, I did, knowing the sentiments of the time, wonder whether these could have been sins of a carnal nature, but I missed the hint that she was pregnant. Sisterly, brotherly, fatherly, motherly, feelings had changed, loved by harsh evidence, thrown from its eminence, even God's providence, seeming estranged. So that was interesting. Okay, so I think I said all I can on the subject. I will move on to the final reading. Yet again, if you have anything to ask, anything you'd like to discuss, please put it in chat and I will look once I have finished rereading this. One more unfortunate, weary of breath, rashly importunate, gone to her death. Take her up tenderly, lift her with care, fashioned so slenderly, young and so fair. Look at her garments, clinging like sermons, whilst the wave constantly drips from her clothing. Take her up instantly, loving not loathing, touch her not scornfully, think of her mournfully, gently and humanly. Not of the stains of her, all that remains of her now is pure womanly. Make no deep scrutiny into her mutiny, rash and undutiful, past all dishonour, death is left on her, only the beautiful. Still for all slips of her, one of Eve's family, wipe those poor lips of her, oozing so clammily. Loop up her tresses, escape from the comb, her fair auburn tresses, whilst wonderment guesses, where was her home? Who was her father? Who was her mother? Had she a sister? Had she a brother? Or was there a dearer one, still and a nearer one, yet than all other? Alas for the rarity of Christian charity under the sun! Oh, it was pitiful, near a whole city full, home she had none. Sisterly, brotherly, fatherly, motherly, feelings had changed, loved by harsh evidence, thrown from its eminence, even God's providence, seeming estranged. While the lamps quiver so far in the river, with many a light, from window and casement, from garret to basement, she stood with amazement, houseless by night. The bleak wind of March made her tremble and shiver, but not the dark arch, or the black flowing river. Mad from life's history, glad to death's mysteries, swift to be hurled, anywhere, out of the world. In she plunged boldly, no matter how coldly, the rough river ran, over the brink of it, picture it, think of it, dissolute man. Lave in it, drink of it, then if you can, take her up tenderly, lift her with care, fashioned so slenderly, young and so fair, ere her limbs frigidly, stiffen too rigidly, decently, kindly, smooth and compose them, and her eyes close them, staring so blindly, dreadfully staring, through muddy impurity, and when with the daring, last look of despairing, fixed on futurity, perishingly, gloomily, spurred by contumely, cold inhumanity, burning insanity, into her rest, cross her hands humbly, as if praying dumbly, over her breast, owning her weakness, her evil behaviour, and leaving with meekness her sins to her Saviour. I would actually like to go back and look up a few of those words. Probably should have done that before. Ceremon. I don't know if that's how it's pronounced. There doesn't appear to be any pronunciation information here. But a ceremon appears to be a burial shroud or garment. Casement. A window sash that is hinged on the side. A window having such sashes, a casement window. So I believe those must be window casements. The opening part casement of a window, usually containing the glass panes, hinged to the jamb or sliding up and down, as in a sash window. Yes. Garret. An attic or semi-finished room just beneath the roof of a house. Contumely. Offensive and abusive language or behaviour. So perishing gloomily, spurred by contumely. So I assume this means spurred in the sense of rejected. Spurred by, meaning, does that mean as she's passing, she's being spurred? So as she passes by, presumably her body in the river, she's being rejected by insult. Have I made up that definition of spur? I think I may have done. Apparently it's something that inspires or motivates, which makes sense from the more concrete meaning of spurs, as in the spurs you would find on boots, to urge a horse onwards. Oh, so spurred by contumely probably means that it encouraged her to take the action that she did, that is to commit suicide, by the contumely treatment she received. So by being insulted and sworn at. That makes sense. Yes, contumely. So, is consume also a word? Doesn't appear to be one. Interesting. Still, that's all the words I wanted to look up. So yeah, a very powerful piece. You can certainly imagine what Thomas Hood was getting at if you have enough historical context to understand what London was like at the time and what English society was like at the time. So I will move on to what will most likely be the final poem we look at today, which is called I Remember, also by Thomas Hood. So, I shall begin. I remember the house where I was born, the little window where the sun came peeping in at morn. He never came a wink too soon, nor brought too long a day, but now I often wish the night had borne my breath away. I remember, the roses red and white, the violets and the lily cups, those flowers made of light, the lilacs where the robin built, and where my brother sat, the laburnum on his birthday, the tree is living yet. I remember, where I was used to swing, and thought the air must rush as fresh to swallows on the wing. My spirit flew in feathers then, that is so heavy now, and summer pools could hardly cool the fever on my brow. I remember, the fir trees dark and high, I used to think their slender tops were close against the sky. It was a childish ignorance, but now 'tis little joy to know I'm farther off from heaven than when I was a boy. Goodness me. That's quite the depressing meditation on life. So I could be wrong, but I think this poem is more or less a statement that in your childish ignorance and the world of sensation you live in at that point, you are closer to God than you are when you're a better informed but less spiritually pure adult. I think that's essentially what it's saying. There appears to be a rhyming structure where even where an even line will rhyme with come in rhyming pairs. Even lines come in rhyming pairs, so it's a sort of A B C B structure. As for meter, I see a mixture of 8-syllable and 6-syllable lines. I don't see much obvious meter though. For example, came peeping in at morn. Doesn't... it sort of works, doesn't it? I'm wondering if it could be iambic, since that seems extremely common. But now I often wish the night. It could be. I remember. Okay, definitely not. Okay, so if there is any poetic meter here, it's at the very least irregular. I'm not sure there is one though. so I'm more knowledgeable and may know better. I don't think there is one. Anyway, I will move on to the final reading here. Again, any questions, anything you want to discuss, please put it into chat, and I will look at it when I've finished. I remember the house where I was born, the little window where the sun came peeping in at morn. He never came a wink too soon, nor brought too long a day, but now I often wish the night had borne my breath away. I remember the roses red and white, the violets in the lily cups, those flowers made of light, the lilacs where the robin built, and where my brother sat. Sorry, I will start again because I really rather made too many mistakes there. I remember the house where I was born, the little window where the sun came peeping in at morn. He never came a wink too soon, nor brought too long a day, but now I often wish the night had borne my breath away. I remember the roses red and white, the violets in the lily cups, those flowers made of light, the lilacs where the robin built, and where my brother sat. The laburnum on his birthday, the tree is living yet. I remember where I was used to swing, and thought the air must rush as fresh to the swallows on the wing. My spirit flew in feathers then, that is so heavy now, and summer pools could hardly cool the fever on my brow. I remember the fir trees dark and high. I used to think their slender tops were close against the sky. It was a childish ignorance, but now 'tis little joy to know I'm farther off from heaven than when I was a boy. So, that's the poetry for this week concluded. I will recap what we read in Pride and Prejudice last week. So, in chapter 30, Mr. Darcy and Colonel Fitzwilliam visit Rosings shortly before Easter. In chapter 31, Lady Catherine views the company of the Collinses, et al., to be less acceptable as when she could get nobody else. Mr. Darcy appears ashamed of his aunt's ill-breeding. In chapter 32, Mr. Darcy mistakenly spends some time with Elizabeth alone in the Collinses' house, and subsequently Charlotte decides that Elizabeth should marry Colonel Fitzwilliam. Specifically, she begins to wonder whether Colonel Fitzwilliam has feelings for Elizabeth, but ultimately decides, well, she can't determine whether he does or not, that they would make a good match. In chapter 33, Mr. Darcy repeatedly meets Elizabeth during her rambles within the park, that is on different days, much to Elizabeth's surprise and misfortune seems a bit harsh, but it's clear this isn't an event which she looks greatly forward to. In conversation, he hints that she may be staying at Rosings the next time she visits the area. This leads Elizabeth to wonder what he's referring to, and wonders if he too is making an allusion towards her marrying Colonel Fitzwilliam. Subsequently, and separate to this, Colonel Fitzwilliam informs Elizabeth that Mr. Darcy congratulates himself on recently saving her friend from the inconveniences of a most imprudent marriage. Elizabeth assumes and imagines that this must be preventing Mr. Bingley from marrying Jane, and Elizabeth's distress at this revelation brings on a headache, which leads her to pass up visiting Rosings that evening, which is notable because I think that's the first time she stayed at home when the Collinses and guests have been invited to Lady Catherine's house for dinner. So that brings us up to where we are. So, chapter 34. When they were gone, Elizabeth, as if intending to exasperate herself as much as possible against Mr. Darcy, chose for employment the examination of all the letters which Jane had written to her since her being in Kent. They contained no actual complaint, nor was there any revival of past occurrences or any communication of present suffering, but in all, in almost every line of each, there was a want of that cheerfulness which had been used to characterize her style, and which, proceeding from the serenity of a mind at ease with itself and kindly disposed towards everyone, had been scarcely ever clouded. Elizabeth noticed every sentence conveying the idea of uneasiness, with an attention which it had hardly received on first perusal. Mr. Darcy's shameful boast of what misery he had been able to inflict gave her a keener sense of her sister's sufferings. There was some consolation to think that his visit to Rosings was to end on the day after the next, and a still greater that in a less than a fortnight she should herself be with Jane again, and enabled to contribute to the recovery of her spirits by all that affection could do. She could not think of Darcy's leaving Kent without remembrance that his cousin was to go with him, but Colonel Fitzwilliam had made it clear that he had no intentions at all, and agreeable as he was, she did not mean to be unhappy about him. While settling this point, she was suddenly roused by the sound of the doorbell, and her spirits were a little fluttered by the idea of it being Colonel Fitzwilliam himself, who had once before called late in the evening, and might now come to inquire particularly after her. But this idea was soon banished, and her spirits were very differently affected when, to her utter amazement, she saw Mr. Darcy walk into the room. In a hurried manner he immediately began an inquiry after her health, imputing his visit to a wish of hearing that she were better. She answered him with cold civility. He sat down for a few moments, and then getting up, walked about the room. Elizabeth was surprised, but said not a word. After a silence of several minutes, he came towards her in an agitated manner, and thus began. In vain I have struggled. It will not do. My feelings will not be repressed. You must allow me to tell you how ardently I admire and love you. Elizabeth's astonishment was beyond expression. She stared, coloured, doubted, and was silent. This he considered sufficient encouragement, and the avowal of all that he felt, and had long felt for her, immediately followed. He spoke well, but there were feelings besides those of the heart to be detailed, and he was not more eloquent on the subject of tenderness than of pride. His sense of her inferiority, of it being a degradation, of the family obstacles which had always opposed to inclination, were dwelt on with a warmth which seemed due to the consequence he was wounding, but was very unlikely to recommend his suit. In spite of her deeply rooted dislike, she could not be insensible to the compliment of such a man's affection, and though her intentions did not vary for an instant, she was at first sorry for the pain he was to receive, till roused to resentment by his subsequent language, she lost all compassion in anger. She tried, however, to compose herself to answer him with patience, when he should have done. He concluded with representing to her the strength of that attachment which, in spite of all his endeavours, he had found it impossible to conquer, and with expressing his hope that it would now be rewarded by her acceptance of his hand. As he said this, she could easily see that he had no doubt of a favourable answer. He spoke of apprehension and anxiety, but his countenance expressed real security. Such a circumstance could only exasperate farther, and when he ceased, the colour rose into her cheeks, and she said, "In such cases as this it is, I believe, the established mode to express a sense of obligation for the sentiments avowed, however unequally they may be returned. It is natural that obligation should be felt, and if I could feel gratitude, I would now thank you, but I cannot. I've never desired your good opinion, and you've certainly bestowed it most unwillingly. I'm sorry to have occasioned pain to anyone. It has been most unconsciously done, however, and I hope will be of short duration. The feelings which you tell me have long prevented the acknowledgment of your regard, can have little difficulty in overcoming it after this explanation. Mr. Darcy, who was leaning against the mantelpiece with his eyes fixed on her face, seemed to catch her words with no less resentment than surprise. His complexion became pale with anger, and the disturbance of his mind was visible in every feature. He was struggling for the appearance of composure, and would not open his lips till he believed himself to have attained it. The pause was to Elizabeth's feelings dreadful. At length, with a voice of forced calmness, he said, "And this is all the reply which I am to have the honour of expecting. I might perhaps wish to be informed why, with so little endeavour at civility, I am thus rejected, but it is of small importance." "I might as well inquire," replied she, "why, with so evident a desire of offending and insulting me, you chose to tell me that you liked me against your will, against your reason, and even against your character. Was not this some excuse for incivility? If I was uncivil, but I have other provocations, you know I have. Had not my feelings decided against you? Had they been indifferent, or had they even been favourable, do you think that any consideration would tempt me to accept the man who has been the means of ruining, perhaps forever, the happiness of a most beloved sister?" As she pronounced these words, Mr. Darcy changed colour, but the emotion was sure, and he listened without attempting to interrupt her while she continued. "I have every reason in the world to think ill of you. No motive can excuse the unjust and ungenerous part you acted there. You dare not, you cannot deny that you have been the principal, if not the only means of dividing them from each other, of exposing one to the censure of the world for caprice and instability, and the other to its derision for disappointed hopes, and involving them both in misery and of the acutest kind." She paused, and saw with no slight indignation that he was listening with an air which proved him wholly unmoved by any feeling of remorse. He even looked at her with a smile of affected incredulity. "Can you deny that you have done it?" she repeated. With assumed tranquillity, he then replied, "I have no wish of denying that I did everything in my power to separate my friend from your sister, or that I rejoiced in my success towards him. I've been kinder than towards myself." Elizabeth disdained the appearance of noticing the civil reflection, but its meaning did not escape, nor was it likely to conciliate her. "But it is not merely this affair," she continued, "on which my dislike is founded. Long before it had taken place, my opinion of you was decided. Your character was unfolded in the recital which I received many months ago from Mr. Wickham. On this subject, what can you have to say? In what imaginary act of friendship can you here defend yourself, or under what misrepresentation can you here impose upon others?" "You take an eager interest in that gentleman's concerns," said Darcy in a less tranquil tone, and with a heightened colour. "Who that knows that his misfortunes have been, can help feeling an interest in him?" "His misfortunes," repeated Darcy contemptuously. "Yes, his misfortunes have been great indeed." "And of your infliction," cried Elizabeth with energy. "You have reduced him to his present state of poverty, comparative poverty. You have withheld the advantages which you must know to have been designed for him. You have deprived the best years of his life of that independence which was no less his due than his desert. You have done all this, and yet you could treat the mention of his misfortune with contempt and ridicule. And this," cried Darcy, as he walked with quick steps across the room, "is your opinion of me. This is the estimation in which you hold me. I thank you for explaining it so fully. My faults, according to this calculation, are heavy indeed, but perhaps," added he, stopping in his walk and turning towards her, "these offences might have been overlooked, had not your pride been hurt by my honest confession of the scruples that had long prevented my forming any serious design. These bitter accusations might have been suppressed, had I, with greater policy, concealed my struggles, and flattered you into the belief of my being impelled by unqualified, unalloyed inclination, by reason, by reflection, by everything. But disguise of every sort is my abhorrence, nor am I ashamed of the feelings I related. They were natural and just. Could you expect me to rejoice in the inferiority of your connections, to congratulate myself on the hope of relations whose condition in life is so decidedly beneath my own?" Elizabeth felt herself growing more angry every moment, yet she tried to the utmost to speak with composure when she said, You are mistaken, Mr. Darcy, if you suppose that the mode of your declaration affected me in any other way than as it spared me the concern which I might have felt in refusing you, had you behaved in a more gentlemanlike manner. She saw him start at this, but he said nothing, and she continued, You could not have made the offer of your hand in any possible way that would have tempted me to accept it. Again his astonishment was obvious, and he looked at her with an expression of mingled incredulity and mortification. She went on, From the very beginning, from the first moment, I may almost say, of my acquaintance with you, your manners, impressing me with the fullest belief of your arrogance, your conceit, and your selfish disdain of the feelings of others, were such as to form the groundwork of disapprobation on which succeeding events have built so immovable a dislike. And I had not known you a month before I felt that you were the last man in the world whom I could ever be prevailed on to marry. You have said quite enough, madame. I perfectly comprehend your feelings, and I have now only to be ashamed of what my own have been. Forgive me for having taken up so much of your time, and accept my best wishes for your health and happiness. And with these words he hastily left the room, and Elizabeth heard him the next moment open the front door and quit the house. The tumult of her mind was now painfully great. She knew not how to support herself, and from an actual weakness sat down and cried for half an hour. Her astonishment, as she reflected on what had passed, was increased by every review of it. That she should receive an offer of marriage from Mr. Darcy, that he should have been in love with her for so many months, so much in love as to wish to marry in spite of all the objections which he made him prevent his friends marrying her sister, and which must appear at least with equal force in his own case, was almost incredible. It was gratifying to have inspired unconsciously so strong an affection, but his pride, his abominable pride, his shameless avowal of what he had done with respect to Jane, his unpardonable assurance in acknowledging, though he could not justify it, and the unfeeling manner in which he had mentioned Mr. Wickham, his cruelty towards whom he had not attempted to deny, soon overcame the pity which the consideration of her attachment had for a moment excited. She continued in very agitated reflections till the sound of Lady Catherine's carriage made her feel how unequal she was to encounter Charlotte's observation, and hurried her away to her room. Chapter 35. Elizabeth awoke the next morning to the same thoughts and meditations which at length closed her eyes. She could not yet recover from the surprise of what had happened. It was impossible to think of anything else, and totally indisposed for her employment, she resolved, soon after breakfast, to indulge herself in an air and exercise. She was proceeding directly to her favourite walk, when the recollections of Mr. Darcy's sometimes coming there stopped her. Instead of entering the park, she turned up the lane, which led farther from the turnpike road. The park paling was still boundary on one side, and she soon passed one of the gates into the ground. After walking 2 or 3 times along the part of the lane, she was tempted by the pleasantness of the morning to stop at the gates and look into the park. The 5 weeks which she had now passed in Kent had made a great difference in the country, and every day was adding to the verdure of the early trees. She was on the point of continuing her walk when she caught a glimpse of a gentleman within the sort of grove which edged the park, who was moving that way, and fearful of it being Mr. Darcy, she was directly retreating. But the person who advanced was now near enough to see her, and stepping forward with eagerness pronounced her name. She had turned away, but on hearing herself called, though in a voice which proved it to be Mr. Darcy, she moved again toward the gate. He had by that time reached it also, and holding out a letter, which she instinctively took, said, with a look of haughty composure, I have been walking in the grove some time in the hopes of meeting you. Will you do me the honour of reading that letter? And then with a slight bow turned again into the plantation, and was soon out of sight. With no expectation of pleasure, but with the strongest curiosity, Elizabeth opened the letter, and to her still increasing wonder perceived an envelope containing 2 sheets of letter paper, written quite through, in a very close hand. The envelope itself was likewise full. Pursuing her way along the lane, she then began it. It was dated from Rosings at 8 o'clock in the morning, and was as follows. Be not alarmed, madame, on receiving this letter by the apprehension of it containing any repetition of those sentiments or renewal of those offers which were last night so disgusting to you. I write without any intention of paining you or humbling myself by dwelling on wishes which, for the happiness of both, cannot be too soon forgotten, and the effort which the formation and perusal of this letter might occasion should have been spared, had not my character required it to be written and read. You must therefore pardon the freedom with which I demand your attention. Your feelings, I know, will bestow it unwillingly, but I demand it of your justice. Too offensive, of a very different nature, and by no means of equal magnitude, you last night laid to my charge. The first mentioned was, that regardless of the sentiments of either, I had detached Mr. Bingley from your sister, and the other, that I had, in defiance of various claims, in defiance of honour and humanity, ruined the immediate prosperity and blasted the prospects of Mr. Wickham, wilfully and wantonly, to have thrown off the companion of my youth, the acknowledged favourite of my father, a young man who had scarcely any other dependence than on our patronage, and who had been brought up to expect its exertion, would be a depravity, to which the separation of two young persons, whose affection could be the growth of only a few weeks, could bear no comparison. But from the severity of that blame which was last night so liberally bestowed, respecting each circumstance, I shall hope to be in the future secured, when the following account of my actions and their motives have been read, if, in the explanation of them, which is due to myself, I am under the necessity of relating feelings which may be offensive to yours, I can only say I am sorry. This necessity must be obeyed, and further apology would be absurd. I had not been long in Hertfordshire before I saw, in common with others, that Bingley preferred your elder sister to any other young woman in the country, but it was not till the evening of the dance at Netherfield that I had any apprehension of his feeling a serious attachment. I had often seen him in love before. At that ball, while I had the honour of dancing with you, I first made acquainted, by Sir William Lucas's accidental information, that Bingley's attentions to your sister had given rise to a general expectation of their marriage. He spoke of it as a certain event, of which the time alone could be undecided. From that moment I observed my friend's behaviour attentively, and I could then perceive that his partiality for Miss Bennet was beyond what I had ever witnessed in him. Your sister I also watched. Her look and manners were open, cheerful, and engaging as ever, but without any symptom of peculiar regard, and I remained convinced from the evening's scrutiny that though she received his attentions with pleasure, she did not invite them by any participation of sentiment. If you have not been mistaken here, I must have been in error. Your superior knowledge of your sister must make the latter probable. If it be so, if I have been misled by such error to inflict pain on her, your resentment has not been unreasonable, but I shall not scruple to assert that the serenity of your sister's countenance and air was such as might have been given the most acute observer a conviction that, however amiable her temper, her heart was not likely to be easily touched. That I was desirous of believing her indifferent is certain, but I will venture to say that my investigation decisions are not usually influenced by my hopes or fears. I did not believe her to be indifferent because I wished it. I believed it on impartial conviction, as truly as I wished it in reason. My objections to the marriage were not merely those which I last night acknowledged to have required the utmost force of passion to put aside. In my own case, the want of connection could not be so great an evil to my friend as to me. But there were other causes of repugnance, causes which, though still existing, and existing to an equal degree in both instances, I had myself endeavoured to forget, because they were not immediately before me. These causes must be stated, though briefly. The situation of your mother's family, though objectionable, was nothing in comparison to that total want of propriety so frequently, so almost uninformally betrayed by herself, by your three younger sisters, and occasionally even by your father. Pardon me. It pains me to offend you, but amidst your concern for the defects of your nearest relations, and your displeasure at this representation of them, let it give you consolation to consider that, to have conducted yourselves so as to avoid any share of the like censure, Is praise no less generally bestowed on you and your elder sister than it is honourably to the sense and disposition of both. I will only say, father, that from what passed that evening, my opinion of all parties was confirmed, and every inducement heightened which could have led me before to preserve my friend from what seemed a unhappy connection. He left Netherfield for London on the day following, as you, I am certain, remember, with the design of soon returning. The part which I acted is now to be explained. His sister's uneasiness had been equally excited with my own. Our coincidence of feeling was soon discovered, and alike sensible that no time was to be lost in detaching their brother, we shortly resolved on joining him directly in London. We accordingly went, and there I readily engaged in the office of pointing out to my friend the certain evil of such a choice. I described and enforced them earnestly, but however this remonstrance might have staggered or delayed his determination, I do not suppose that it would ultimately have prevented the marriage, had it not been seconded by the assurance that I hesitated not in giving of your sister's indifference. He had before believed her to return his affection with sincere, if not with equal regard, but Bingley had great natural modesty, with a stronger dependence on my judgment than on his own. To convince him, therefore, that he had deceived himself was no very difficult point. To persuade him against returning into Hertfordshire, when that conviction had been given, was scarcely the work of a moment. I cannot blame myself for having done thus much. There is but one part of my conduct in the whole affair on which I do not reflect with satisfaction. It is that I condescended to adopt the measures of art so far as to conceal from him your sister's being in town. I knew it myself, as it was known to Miss Bingley, but her brother is even yet ignorant of it. That they might have met without ill consequence is perhaps probable, but his regard did not appear to me enough extinguished for him to see her without some danger. Perhaps this concealment, this disguise was beneath me. It is done, however, and it was done for the best. On this subject I have nothing more to say, no other apology to offer. If I have wounded your sister's feelings, it was unknowingly done, and though the motives which governed me may to you very naturally appear insufficient, I have not yet learnt to condemn them. With respect to the other, more weighty accusation of having injured Mr. Wickham, I can only refute it by laying before you the whole of his connection with my family. Of what he has particularly accused me I am ignorant, but of the truth of what I shall relate I can summon more than one witness of undoubted veracity. Mr. Wickham is the son of a very respectable man who had for many years the management of all the Pemberley estates, and his good conduct in the discharge of his trust naturally inclined my father to be of service to him, and on George Wickham, who was his godson. His kindness was therefore liberally bestowed. My father supported him at school, and afterwards at Cambridge. Most important assistance, as his own father, always poor from the extravagance of his wife, would have been unable to give him a gentleman's education. My father was not only fond of this young man's society, his manners were always engaging, he had also the highest opinion of him, and hoping the church would be his profession, intended to provide for him in it. As for myself, it is many, many years since I first began to think of him in a very different manner. The vicious propensities, the want of principle, which he was careful to guard from the knowledge of his best friend, could not escape the observation of a young man of nearly the same age with himself, and who had opportunities of seeing him in unguarded moments, which Mr. Darcy could not have. That being, the Mr. Darcy being referred to here is, of course, the father of the Mr. Darcy who wrote this letter. Here again I shall give you pain. To what degree you can only tell. To what degree you can only tell. No, I didn't. To what degree you only can tell. But whatever may be the sentiments which Mr. Wickham has created, a suspicion of their nature shall not prevent me from unfolding his real character. It adds even another motive. My excellent father died about 5 years ago, and his attachment to Mr. Wickham was to the last so steady that in his will he particularly recommended it to me to promote his advancement in the best manner that his profession might allow, and if he took orders, desired that a valuable family living might be as soon as it might be his as soon as it became vacant. There was also a legacy of £1,000. His own father did not long survive mine, and within half a year from these events, Mr. Wickham wrote to inform me that, having finally resolved against taking orders, he hoped I should not think it unreasonable for him to expect some more immediate pecuniary advantage in lieu of the preferment by which he could not be benefited. He had some intentions, he added, of studying law, and I must be aware that the interest of £1,000 would be a very insufficient support therein. I rather wished than believed him to be sincere, but at any rate was perfectly ready to accede to his proposal. I knew that Mr. Wickham ought not to be a clergyman. The business was therefore soon settled. He resigned all claim to assistance in the church, were it possible that he could ever be in a situation to receive it, and accepted in return £3,000. All connection between us seemed now dissolved. I thought too ill of him to invite him to Pemberley or admit his society in town. In town I believe he chiefly lived, but his studying law was a mere pretence, and being now free from all restraint, his life was a life of idleness and dissipation. For about 3 years I heard little of him, but on the decease of the incumbent of the living which had been designed for him, he applied to me again by letter for the presentation. His circumstances, he assured me, and I had no difficulty in believing it, were exceedingly bad. He had found the law a most unprofitable study, and was now absolutely resolved on being ordained. If I would present him to the living in question, of which he trusted there could be little doubt, as he was well assured that I had no other person to provide for, and could not have forgotten my revered father's intentions, he will hardly blame me for refusing to comply with this entreaty, or for resisting every repetition to it. His resentment was in proportion to the distress of his circumstances, and he was doubtless as violent in his abuse of me to others as in his reproaches to myself. After this period, every appearance of acquaintance was dropped. How he lived I know not, but last summer he was again most painfully obtruded on my notice. I must now mention a circumstance which I would wish to forget myself, and which no obligation less than the present should induce me to unfold to any human being. Having said thus much, I feel no doubt of your secrecy. My sister, who is more than 10 years my junior, was left to the guardianship of my mother's nephew, Colonel Fitzwilliam, and myself. About a year ago she was taken from school, and an establishment formed for her in London, and last summer she went with the lady who presided over it to Ramsgate, and thither also went Mr. Wickham, undoubtedly by design, for there proved to have been a prior acquaintance between him and Mrs. Young, in whose character we were most unhappily deceived, and by her connivance and aid he so far recommended himself to Georgina, whose affectionate heart retained a strong impression of his kindness to her as a child, that she was persuaded to believe herself in love, and to consent to an elopement. She was then but 15, which must be her excuse. And after stating her imprudence, I am happy to add that I owed the knowledge of it to herself. I joined them unexpectedly a day or two before the intended elopement, and then Georgina, unable to support the idea of grieving and offending a brother whom she almost looked up to as a father, acknowledged the whole to me. You may imagine what I felt and how I acted. Regard for my sister's credit and feeling prevented any public exposure. I wrote to Mr. Wickham, who left this place immediately. Mrs. Young was of course removed from her charge. Mr. Wickham's chief object was unquestionably my sister's fortune, which is £30,000. I cannot help supposing that the hope of revenging himself on me was a strong inducement. His revenge would have been complete indeed. This, madam, is a faithful narrative of every event in which we have been concerned together, and if you do not absolutely reject it as false, you will, I hope, acquit me henceforth of cruelty towards Mr. Wickham. I know not in what manner, under what form of falsehood he had imposed on you, but his success is not perhaps to be wondered at. Ignorant as you previously were of everything concerned, either detection could not be in your power, and suspicion certainly not in your inclination. You may possibly wonder why all this was not told to you last night, but I was not then master enough of myself to know what could or ought to be revealed. For the truth of everything here related, I can appeal more particularly to the testimony of Colonel Fitzwilliam, who, from our near relationship and constant intimacy, and still more as one of the executioners of my father's will, has been unavoidably acquainted with every particular of these transactions. If your abhorrence of me should make my assertions valueless, you cannot be prevented by the same cause from confiding in my cousin, and that there may be the possibility of consulting him. I shall endeavour to find some opportunity of putting this letter in your hands in the course of the morning. I'll only add, God bless you, Fitzwilliam Darcy. Chapter 36. If Elizabeth, when Mr. Darcy gave her the letter, did not expect it to contain a renewal of his feelings, she had formed no expectation at all of its contents. If Elizabeth, when Darcy gave her the letter, did not expect it to contain a renewal of his offers, she had formed no expectation at all of its contents. But such as they were, it may well be supposed how eagerly she went through them, and what a contrariety of emotion they excited. Her feelings as she read were scarcely to be defined. With amazement did she first understand that he believed any apology to be in his power, and steadfastly was persuaded that he could have no explanation to give which a just sense of shame could not conceal. With a strong prejudice against everything he might say, she began his account of what had happened at Netherfield. She read with an eagerness which hardly left her power of comprehension, and from impatience of knowing what the next sentence might bring, was incapable of attending to the sense of the one before her eyes. His belief of her sister's insensibility she instantly resolved to be false, and his account of the worst objections to the match, made her too angry to have any wish of doing him justice. He expressed no regret for what he had done which satisfied her. His style was not penitent but haughty. It was all pride and insolence. But when this subject was succeeded by his account of Mr. Wickham, when she read with somewhat clearer attention a relation of events which, if true, must overthrow every cherished opinion of his worth, which was so alarming an affinity to his own history of himself, her feelings were yet more acutely painful and more difficult of definition. Astonishment, apprehension, and even horror oppressed her. She wished to discredit it entirely, repeatedly exclaiming, "This must be false, this cannot be, this must be the grossest of falsehood." And when she had gone through the whole letter, though scarcely knowing anything of the last page or two, put it hastily away, protesting that she would not regard it, that she would never look at it again. In this perturbed state of mind, with thoughts that could rest on nothing, she walked on, but it would not do. In half a minute the letter was unfolded again, and collecting herself as well as she could, she again began the mortifying perusal of all that related to Wickham, and commanded herself so far as to examine the meaning of every sentence. The account of his connection with the Pemberley family was exactly what he had related himself, and the kindness of the late Mr. Darcy, though she had not before known its extent, agreed equally well with his own words. So far each recital confirmed the other, but when she came to the will, the difference was great. What Wickham had said on the living was fresh in her memory, and as she recalled his very words, it was impossible not to feel that there was gross duplicity on one side or the other, and, for a few moments, she flattered herself that her wishes did not err. But when she read and re-read with the closest attention the particulars immediately following of Mr. Wickham's resigning all pretensions to the living, of his receiving in lieu so considerable a sum as £3,000, again was she forced to hesitate. She put down the letter, weighed every circumstance of what she meant to be impartiality, deliberated on the probability of each statement, but with little success. On both sides it was only assertion. Again she read on, but every line proved more clearly that the affair, which she had believed it impossible that any contrivance could so represent as to render Mr. Darcy's conduct in it less than infamous, was capable of a turn which must make him entirely blameless throughout the whole. The extravagance and general profligacy, let's look that up. Careless wastefulness, shameless and immoral behaviour. The extravagance and general profligacy, which he scrupled not to lay at Mr. Wickham's charge, exceedingly shocked her, the more so as she could bring no proof of its injustice. She had never heard of him before his entrance into the Shire militia, in which he had engaged in the persuasion of the young man who, on meeting him accidentally in town, had there renewed a slight acquaintance. Of his former way of life nothing had been known in Hertfordshire, but what he told himself As to his real character, had information been in her power, she had never felt a wish of inquiring. Her countenance, voice, and manner his countenance, voice, and character had established him at once in the possession of every virtue. She tried to recollect some instance of goodness, some distinguished trait of integrity or benevolence, that might rescue him from the attacks of Mr. Darcy, or at least, by the predominance of virtue, atone for those casual errors under which she would endeavour to class what Mr. Darcy described as the idleness and vice of many years' continuance. But no such recollection befriended her. She could see him instantly before her, in every charm of air and address, but she could remember no more substantial good than the general approbation of the neighbourhood, and the regard to which his social powers had gained him in the mess. After pausing on this point a considerable while, she once more continued to read, but alas, the story which followed of his designs on Miss Darcy received some confirmation from what had passed between Colonel Fitzwilliam and herself only the morning before, and at last she was referred for the truth of every particular to Colonel Fitzwilliam himself, from whom she had previously received the information of his near concern in all his cousin's affairs, and whose character she had no reason to question. At one time she had almost resolved on applying to him, but the idea was checked by the awkwardness of the application, and at length wholly banished by the conviction that Mr. Darcy would never have hazarded such a proposal if he had not been well assured of his cousin's corroboration. She perfectly remembered everything that had passed in conversation between Wickham and herself, and their first evening at Mr. Phillip's. Many of his expressions were still fresh in her memory. She was now struck with the impropriety of such communications to a stranger, and wondered it had escaped her before. She saw the indelicacy of putting himself forward as he had done, and the inconsistency of his professions with his conduct. She remembered that he had boasted of having no fear of seeing Mr. Darcy, that Mr. Darcy might leave the country, but that he should stand his ground. Yet he had avoided the Netherfield ball the very next week. She remembered also that, till the Netherfield family had quitted the country, he had told his story to no one but herself, but that after the removal it had been everywhere discussed, and that he had no reserves, no scruples in sinking Mr. Darcy's character, though he had assured her that respect for the father would always prevent his exposing the son. How differently did everything now appear in which he was concerned. His attentions to Miss King were now the consequence of views solely and hatefully mercenary, and the mediocrity of her fortune proved no longer the moderation of his wishes, but his eagerness to grasp at anything. His behaviour to herself could now have had no tolerable motive. He had either been deceived with regard to her fortune, or had been gratifying his vanity by encouraging the preference which he believed she had most incautiously shown. Every lingering struggle in his favour grew fainter and fainter, and in farther justification of Mr. Darcy, she could not but allow that Mr. Bingley, when questioned by Jane, had long ago asserted his blamelessness in the affair. That proud and repulsive as were his manners, she had never, in the whole course of their acquaintance, an acquaintance which had latterly brought them much together, and given her a sort of intimacy with his ways, seen anything that betrayed him to be unprincipled or unjust, anything that spoke him of irreligious or immoral habits, that among his own connections he was esteemed and valued, that even Wickham had allowed him merit as a brother, and that she had often heard him speak so affectionately of his sister as to prove him capable of some amiable feeling, that had his actions been what Mr. Wickham represented them, so gross a violation of everything right could hardly have been concealed from the world, and that friendship between a person capable of it and such an amiable man as Mr. Bingley was incomprehensible. She grew absolutely ashamed of herself. Of neither Darcy nor Wickham could she think without feeling. She had been blind, partial, prejudiced, absurd. "How despicable I have acted," she cried. "I, who have prided myself on my discernment, I, who have valued myself on my abilities, who have often disdained the generous candour of my sister, and gratified my vanity in useless or blamable mistrust. How humiliating is this discovery! Yet how just a humiliation! Had I been in love, I could not have been more wretchedly blind. But vanity, not love, has been my folly. Pleased with the preference of one, and offended by the neglect of the other. On the very beginning of our acquaintance, I have courted prepossession and ignorance, and driven reason away, where either were concerned. Till this moment I never knew myself." From herself to Jane, from Jane to Bingley, her thoughts were in line which soon brought her to recollection that Darcy's explanation there had appeared very insufficient, and she read it again. Widely different was the effect of a second perusal. How could she deny that credit to his assertions in one instance which she had been obliged to give in the other? Sorry, let me say that again. How could she deny that credit to his assertions in one instance which she had been obliged to give in the other? How could she deny that credit to his assertions in one instance, which she had been obliged to give in the other? He declared himself to be totally unsuspicious of her sister's attachment, and that she could not help remembering that Charlotte's opinion had always been. Neither could she deny the justice of his descriptions of Jane. She felt that Jane's feelings, so fervent, were little displayed, and that there was a constant complacency in her air and manner not often united with great sensibility. When she came to that part of the letter in which her family were mentioned in terms of such mortifying yet merited reproach, a sense of shame was severe. The justice of the charge struck her too forcibly for denial, and the circumstances which he particularly alludes as having passed at the Netherfield ball, and as confirming all his first disapprobation, could not have been a stronger impression on his mind than on hers. The compliment to herself and her sister was not unfelt. It soothed, but it could not console her for the contempt which had thus been self-attracted by the rest of her family. And as she considered that Jane's disappointment had in fact been the work of her nearest relations, and reflected how materially the credit of both must be hurt by such impropriety of conduct, she felt depressed beyond anything she had ever known before. After wandering along the lane for 2 hours, giving way to every variety of thought, reconsidering events, determining probabilities, and reconciling herself, as well as she could, to a change so sudden and so important, fatigue and a recollection of her long absence made her at length return home. and she entered the house with the wish of appearing cheerful as usual, and the resolution of repressing such reflections as to make her unfit for conversation. She was immediately told that two gentlemen from Rosings had each called during her absence, Mr. Darcy only for a few minutes to take leave, but that Colonel Fitzwilliam had been sitting with them at least an hour, hoping for a return, and almost resolving to walk after her till she could be found. Elizabeth could just affect concern in missing him. She really rejoiced at it. Colonel Fitzwilliam was no longer an object. She could think only of her letter. So, that concludes the prose section of our stream. Quite a interesting turn of events. Still, onto the riddles. I believe that the last riddle we looked at was 65. So, that would be, I believe that was the last one we did complete last week, unsuccessfully if I recall correctly. So as usual, we'll read that one first and we'll move on. No mouth, no tongue, no nose, no ears have I. I neither walk, nor stand, nor run, nor fly. No sense I boast, or of myself can harm the smallest fly, or breathe the least alarm. Yet when into the hands of man I come, no furious fiend from Tartarus or Rome, that spreads her baleful poison as she flies, and with her breath contaminates the skies, can boast such mischief as takes birth from me, the noble and ignoble, bond and free. Alike my comforts or my terrors feel, my poignant far than swords of sharpest steel. 'Tis I instruct and prompt the wrangling bar, 'tis I forerun the miseries of war. Yet sainted martyrs owe alone to me the inspiring records of their constancy. Foes I make friends, and friends I oft make foes, yet I alike am true to these and those. What's more strange, I, who can boast such power, am still dependent on the flecking hour. My powers by age, but more by use decline. My powers, if ever I might call them mine, for of myself I nothing can perform. No reason guides me, and no passions warm, till at last, like merit scorned, I lie in some dark corner thrown neglected by. There lie and rot, as time and chance agree, to fix my lot, or date my destiny. Now I must admit, I'm not 100% sure, but I believe the solution to that one was a pen. So, let's check. Nope. Sorry for getting the page numbers. I've gone right past it, haven't I? Sorry about that. A pen. So, 66. If you join to 5, 6 with 1/8 of 18, you will know what in blockheads was never yet seen. If you draw into 5, 6 with 1/8 of 18, you will know what in blockheads was never yet seen. This one has me really quite stuck. No, I don't know. I suppose I must be a blockhead. I'm gonna look it up because I really don't have a clue. Unless anyone in chat would like to make a guess. Wit. Wit. I don't follow. I mean, that can't even be Roman numerals, even if we allowed a double V to be a W. Oh, actually, 5 would be V, 6 would be VI. So that gets us a lot of the way there. So then we're just left with, how do you get from with 1/8 of 18 to T? What would 18 be? 18 would be... X, V, I. The only way I could see that making a T would be if it was some sort of absurd suggestion that you're taking, because there's only 5 characters there of varying length. You could say, well, if you're taking 1/8 of it, you're not even taking a whole character, you're taking a bit of a character. And say if you took one of the eyes but then chopped off the bottom, that's 1/8 of 18. That's the only way that makes sense to me. But it sounds like a nonsense. But I think that must be related to how they're doing it, because the 5 and the 6 makes sense. VVI making WI, that makes sense. It's just the 1/8 of 18 making a T that I don't follow. Anyway, that's the answer. Let's try 66. Sorry, 67. From an exalted youth my name I take, though great the difference twixt our shape and make. He 'tis believed was formed like other men, but that's a shape I never can attain. For I've no legs, though oftentimes I move, and many 100 miles from home I rove, nor have I always wings to aid my flight, though much by day I travel and by night, and though I've sometimes wings, they give no speed, nor do they either much my course impede. My nature's stubborn, for I never move. Yep, it's still the same one. Without reluctance, or unless I'm drove, in various hues I'm dressed, as suits the fancy, sometimes to please Sir John, sometimes Miss Nancy. But ladies, pray be careful how you use me, for should I be ill used, I may abuse ye, though if you use me with great care and skill, 'tis seldom that I disobey your will. Interesting. Oh, from an exalted youth my name I take. Why do I get the impression that's going to be a reference to something I don't know? Like if they had a particular type of makeup that was named after a Greek mythological figure or something like that. Like Adonis or something. I think, and though I've sometimes wings they give no speed, must be a colossal hint to something that I'm afraid I just don't know. It implies that it can have a component which in the English language is called a wing, but which is not a bird's wing. I mean, buildings can have wings, but they don't move many miles. And many hundred miles from home I rove. That is interesting, as at the very least it suggests that whatever the solution is, it has a home. It has a place it is specifically associated with. My nature's stubborn, for I never move without reluctance or unless I'm drove. That is very interesting, especially since it says or less I'm drove. Not only if I'm drove. So this is presumably something that can move without being driven, but generally would be driven. But ladies, pray be careful how you use me, dum-de-dum-de-dum, though if you use me with great care and skill, 'tis seldom that I disobey your will. So this is something that ladies can use. That's interesting. That makes it unlikely to be something... Does it? That sounds to me like it's not going to be something like a carriage. Because carriages, back then, would have had a driver. And that driver, as far as I'm aware, would have been male. Because at one point I was wondering, could this be some type of carriage that they had, which happened to have some component on it that was called a wing? Because I don't know, it stuck out from the sides in a vaguely aerodynamic looking way or something. Not actually for aerodynamic purposes, but just, you know, having that appearance. I don't know. I'm gonna give up again. I don't like to give up, but I'm gonna have to admit defeat on this one. I just don't think I'm gonna get it. A phaeton. That's a type of carriage. So I was thinking along the right lines, but clearly I didn't have the necessary knowledge. It's funny in a way, because obviously I know what a phaeton is. So you could argue I should have got that. But I suppose I just didn't know enough to be able to pin it to being a phaeton precisely. So Phaeton, in mythological terms, was the son of Helios, the personification of the god. In most authors, Phaeton is the son of Helios, and out of desire to have his parentage confirmed, travels to the sun god's palace in the east. There he is recognised by his father and asks him for the privilege to drive his chariot for a single day. Despite Helios' fervent warnings and attempt to talk him out of it, counting the numerous dangers he would face in his celestial journey, and reminding Phaethon that only he can control the horses, the boy is not dissuaded, and he does not change his mind. He is then allowed to take the chariot's reins. I think this is the story that leads to him almost crushing the sun into the earth. His ride is disastrous as he cannot keep a firm grip on the horses. As a result, he drives the chariot too close to the earth, burning it, and too far from it, freezing it. In the end, after many complaints from the stars in the sky, to the earth itself, Zeus strikes Phaeton with one of his lightning bolts, killing him instantly. His dead body falls into the river Eridanus, and his sisters, the Heliads, are turned to black poplar trees as they mourn him. Yeah. So he even had a vague recollection of that story, so I guess the knowledge was there, but just not... I just wasn't sufficiently intelligent to connect it all. It was a form of... Also, a phaeton was a form of sporty open carriage popular in the late 18th and early 19th century. Drawn by one or two horses, a phaeton typically featured a minimal, very light sprung body atop four extravagantly large wheels with open seating. It was both fast and dangerous, giving rise to its name, drawn from the mythical Phaeton, son of Helios, who nearly set the earth on fire while attempting to drive the chariot of the sun. No mention of a wing, though. So, that's presumably a term for part of an optional part of a phaeton, which, although I'm sure it would be known today, isn't particularly well known or used anymore. One more. We'll finish on 68. With use and beauty blessed, from distant lands I came, nor has the country been ashamed to let me bear her name. No lady yet could ever boast complexion half so fine, though now my colour's black as those that dig in the coal mine. When I was young and fair, a happy life was mine, by a fond mistress was caressed, and in her sweet did shine. But from the jilt, as years advanced, as I grew thin and old, the usage that I then received, you'll scarce believe when told. With iron pincers then she seized upon my tender frame, and forced me by consuming fire to change my form and name. Within a dungeon, close and dark, unhappy am I thrown, with villains who have hearts as hard as iron or of stone, nor can I ever hope that they will mercy to me show, when they do nothing else but give each other blow for blow. A hateful match, oh, then she did most cruelly provide a circumstance I much desired for everyone to hide, for evermore to hide. Nor had I named it, but I know my fellow prisoners' spite is such that they would never rest till I was brought to light. Well, this is an interesting one, isn't it? With youth and beauty blessed, from distant lands I came, nor has the country been ashamed to let me bear her name. That seems like a massive clue, but I don't know to what. No lady yet could ever boast complexion half so fine, though now my colour's black as those that dig in the coal mine. So was it originally white? When I was young and fair, a happy life was mine, by a fond mistress was caressed, and in her sweet did shine. Caressed. Interesting. There presumably aren't many objects one would caress. But from jilt as years advanced, as I grew thin and old, so it loses its form changes. Whatever this object is, it's presumably losing its external shape, its extremities rather, due to use. The usage that I then received you'll scarce believe when told. With iron pincers then she seized upon my tender frame, and forced me by consuming fire to change my form and name. Within a dungeon close and dark, unhappy I am thrown, with villains who have hearts as hard as iron or of stone, nor can I ever hope that they will mercy to me show, when they do nothing else but give each other blow for blow. A hateful match, oh, then did she most cruelly provide a circumstance I much desired for everyone to hide, nor had I named it, but I know my fellow prisoners' spite, in such that they would never rest till I was brought to light. See, when they were talking about caressing an object and it losing its substance, or losing some of its substance, I was thinking, could it be like a bar of soap? Like, that would make sense. It said it was in a lady's suite. I'm not entirely sure what they mean by suite, but if that's where we get ensuite from, that would make sense. But then, why would they be burning the remains? Oh, incidentally, there were different types of soap historically. I don't know what was about at the turn of the 19th century when this was written. But I do know that certainly in medieval times, soaps that were available were very much graded by one's position in life. Generally speaking, the wealthier you were, the more white and pure your soap would be, and the more fragrant it would be. So there were, for example, grey soaps, which, you know, were relatively fragrant, but not overly perfumed, that would have been very much available, or would be available on a large scale to people who were certainly not of the working class, so certainly above that, but not very high, not having a high position, relatively speaking. Whereas the nobles would have very perfumed white soaps. That was the case in medieval England. I don't know what it would have been like at the turn of the 19th century, and of course the solution to this may well not be soap. But just for context, those were the lines that I was thinking along. But then, why would you... I can understand how once it had been mostly used, you'd want to do something with it. But why would you put it in a fire and then, as this riddle seems to suggest, change its form and name? But I'm really struggling to think of anything else which one would routinely caress and which would lose its and would get smaller as a result. I'll try reading once more. With youth and beauty blessed, from distant lands I came. Interesting. I'm not sure it is true that soap originally came from distant lands. As in that soap is very much something that could have been independently discovered almost anywhere. But it's certainly true to say that the most expensive soaps would have been imported in medieval England. Nor has the country been ashamed to let me bear her name. Ah, I missed that. So this isn't named after Britain or the United Kingdom. This is named after a distant land. That, if I knew the answer, that would probably be enough of a hint. Like, for example, there's a piece of furniture called an ottoman. Like, that would, you know, the Ottoman Empire was an empire at this point in time. I think that would have been... Were that the solution, I think that would be sufficiently clear. So I'm wondering if this is something I just don't know of. No lady yet could ever boast complexion half so fine, though now my colour's black as those that dig in the coal mine. When I was young and fair, a happy life was mine. By a fond mistress was caressed, and in her sweet did shine. But from the jilt as years advanced, as I grew thin and old, the usage that I then received would scarce you'll scarce believe when told. With iron pincers then she seized upon my tender frame, and forced me by consuming fire to change my form and name. Within a dungeon close and dark, unhappy I am thrown, with villains who have hearts as hard as iron or of stone. Nor can I ever hope that they will mercy to me show, when they do nothing else but give each other blow for blow. A hateful match, oh, then she did, most cruelly provide, a circumstance I much desired for everyone to hide. Nor had I named it, but I know my fellow prisoners' spite is such that they would never rest till I was brought to light. See, that sounds like setting fire to something, but I'm not convinced that if you were to put soap in fire, you would end up with something that was absolutely brilliant for fire lighting. I've not tried it. An old-fashioned soap probably would catch fire quite readily, both because of the fats that make it up and the especially if it was a perfumed one, all the essential oils I assume would burn quite happily. So I would guess that soap would be flammable. So you could probably make a candle out of one, if you so desired, but I'm still not convinced it would make a brilliant candle, as opposed to just making an ordinary candle. Still, I'm gonna have to pass on this one again, unfortunately. Let's find out what it is, and what country it's named after. Irish cloth and tinder. I had not heard of that. Nope, I can't find any reference to it. Doing a quick look online. So that one's a mystery. I don't know. I could only speculate. My speculation was maybe there was a type of cloth that was used for towels or something, and then when it was used up it was turned into tinder. I don't know. Only my idle speculation. I don't have a clue. Oh well, even if I didn't get any today, that was at least very interesting. So, thank you everyone for coming. I hope you enjoyed the stream. The intention is that I will stream on Friday and Saturday some more Pokemon Crystal, and then come Monday I'll be returning to Grim Fandango, and then next Wednesday it'll be more poetry, prose and riddles. There had been a suggestion, or rather I suggested at the end of my stream on Monday, that I might have the opportunity to do some more streaming this week, and that might change my schedule a bit. That's looking a lot less likely now, But if anything like that does happen, I will announce it on Twitter. So once again, thank you for coming everyone, and I hope you have a wonderful night.